morning. Next up is Professor Sarita Malik, Professor of Media and Communications at Brunel, and the theme now is culture.
Okay, thank you, Andrew. So, a lot's been said in the past few weeks and months about what Brexit reveals to us about culture, about the impact that the EU exit will have on future arts funding, for example, on the freedom of movement of artists, and what the new cultural priorities will be. From a wider perspective of culture, it's also raised other questions. What exactly is it that we are exiting from? What cultural legacies, for example, are we leaving behind? And what cultural kind of future are we imagining and heading towards? So I'm going to focus briefly on two dimensions of culture. The first one is the kind of practical dimension of what does leaving the EU actually mean for the cultural sector, both practically but also in terms of a post-EU sensibility. And secondly, what do the deep divisions within our society that many of the speakers have alluded to that have been exposed by the referendum actually tell us about our cultural identity? So, the creative industries have become a key feature of government economic and cultural policy across the world, and the UK has been a policy leader in promoting the creative media industries, for example. So we think about our television, our film, radio, computer games, publishing, and we're globally seen as an outstanding creative nation with, for example, a world-class audiovisual workforce. So figures published in 2016 by DCMS state that the UK's creative industries are now worth £84.1 billion per year to the UK economy. Or if you want a more kind of snappy statistic, that's nearly £10 million per hour. The 2016 government white paper, which was the first one to be published since 1965, starts with a quote from our former Prime Minister, David Cameron, and he says, "If you believe in publicly funded arts, as I passionately do, then you must also believe in equality of access, attracting all and welcoming all." Now, it's very useful to note in that language that Cameron emphasises the civic value of the arts, something that's recognised, I think, by all of us here. It's recognised across party political lines, and also the role of culture as part of a wider democratic project underpinned by this idea of connection and collaboration. So it suggests a kind of openness towards culture and indeed cultural difference. When Theresa May said last week at the Tory party conference that those who subscribe to a cosmopolitan identity are, to use her phrase, citizens of nowhere, this suggested instead a retreat, a closing down, a quite negative approach to the idea of globalism that goes against actually a lot of what our arts and culture are actually built on, not just in terms of claims, but what they've actually accomplished as well. British arts, whether it's kind of more mainstream funded or more grassroots interventions, they've been founded on this amalgamation of different cultures, different forms, and have actually produced some of the most dynamic, transcultural examples of hybridity, ranging from, we can think about popular music, to literature, to cinema. Thinking practically, in the short term, there's an assurance from the UK government that funding from European structural and investment funds will be guaranteed. What happens after that without EU capital grants is, currently unknown. It's one of those many uncertainties that we've been referencing today. Europe has provided additional funding for the UK arts sector over several years, such as the £1.3 billion Creative Europe programme, and that's helped fund, for example, experimental independent cinema in the UK. Liverpool's sterling prize-winning Everyman was partially funded by the EU, and the coveted European Capital of Culture Prize can provide a real renaissance for cities, as we've seen with Liverpool in 2008, and as Leeds hopes will happen in 2023. So there's real practical concerns now about the need to build a creative skills base in the UK, about cross-European artistic exchanges, the exchange of cultural products, not to mention the kind of nitty-gritty of issues around access, training, copyright, and so on. Beyond the practical issues, there's a bigger cultural shift that's taking place, and it's been alluded to in some of the previous presentations. Now, one of the major facets of culture is language, the kind of language we use and what's deemed acceptable and not. Language matters because it's not an abstract notion. It actually organises and regulates our social practices, what we actually do. A new public language of exclusion and inclusion has emerged, empowering new narratives that manifest in practice, as the rise in race-hate crimes in recent months has proved. The focal point has become, somehow, but also quite obviously, migrants, or those perceived to be migrants, cultural outsiders. Now, although we may not think in those terms in this room, the fact is that the debate around immigration framed the way in which the Brexit referendum, the vote to be in or out, was framed. There was talk about taking back control. There was talk about reclaiming our borders. There was talk about Independence Day, returning to an era when Britain was a global power. And this is actually something has been fueled by large parts of another part of our UK national culture, and that's the UK press. Now, the roots of this run very deep, and that's why, in a way, I do want to reflect, I do want to look back, and I want to talk a little bit about history and culture. The former director of the British Museum, Neil McGregor, urges us to think more critically about our history. And he said this week, "In Britain, we use our history in order to comfort us, to make us feel stronger. The chapters we insist on are the sunny ones. This sort of handling of history is dangerous as well as regrettable," he says. The Leave EU campaign has been especially persuasive, I want to suggest, because of its timing, unfolding in the shadow of the EU's border crisis and new security agendas within modern states. It's a time of deepening inequalities, austerity measures, and a backlash against actually the liberal tenets of British multiculturalism that had made headway during the 1980s, that liberal consensus that was alluded to earlier. But at its core, Brexit has been about a lot of the country wanting change, cultural and otherwise, about wanting to challenge the establishment, symbolised here by a bureaucratic EU machine. It can be seen as a revolt against globalisation, open borders, and also as a protest vote by those who feel alienated, coinciding with the search for national and cultural identity. Feelings that have been incubating for some time now in different spaces and communities. And we can see this actually unravelling globally if we think about what's happening in the US currently. And so to my second point, how the Britain and Europe question has shed light on the entrenched divisions in our society. Again, this has been referenced today. And the cracks are not neat or obvious. The rising to the surface of new tensions has many implications, not just for the cultural industries, but also for culture more widely. For example, a strong youth vote to remain in the EU, I know we're going to go on to talk about youth next, and apparently also by those in the creative sector, will possibly produce new frustrations. A growing cultural minority demographic are feeling more vulnerable, rightly so, after the referendum. The major regional inequalities in the cultural sector, such as its very large London-centric investment base, deepens the disconnect that many outside of London already feel. And the cultural antennae of national cultural organisations, if we think about the National Theatre or the British Film Institute, well, they're going to have to be much better aligned now to reflect and speak to our divided Britain. The political society that we live in affects who we are culturally. I suppose that's basically what I'm saying. And that culture is always tied to social structure. So looking to the future, there's two final points that I'll end on. The first is this pull between the past and the present and the future, linking Britain's post-imperial history and globalisation. Globalisation is something that we cannot now rewind. Cultural purity, or in this case, the way it's been framed, this kind of fantasy of a unified Englishness, it maintains itself by projecting difference onto others, and that is highly problematic. But more than that, nostalgia also attempts to summon up what's actually an irretrievable past. So my concern is, what happens to a society when such fantasies are not met? What happens when it's realised that cultural purity, or any idea of cultural purity, it's not the solution to economic inequality or social dislocation? And what will the cultural response be? So the very final point is where there's perhaps more hope in terms of the kinds of culture and creativity that history has shown us is produced in politically turbulent times. How will the nation, from grassroots arts cultures to national soap operas on television, narrate itself to itself? It's likely that we're actually going to see the formation of new styles and modes of cultural production and different kinds of, I hope, reflexive opportunities for cultural producers and indeed publics to look back and critically reevaluate both our relationship with globalisation but also with ourselves. Thank you.